My 16-year-old sister left a note and made us hold a closed casket funeral while she built a cabin in Sweden for 5 years, using the coordinates hidden in her final letter. So I decoded everything. That was 3 years ago. She still won't come home and sends our divorced parents one photo each Christmas from the same forest that destroyed our family. My sister was sad for most of her life. My parents and I don't know what caused it, but we think it might be from kids being mean to her at school. And what our uncle did to her, he was found guilty of roping her, made things worse. I remember she began cutting herself when she was just 12, and I tried so hard to help her. One thing about my sister is that she loved nature and despised the prospect of growing up in a busy city while working a regular job. I remember the only time she seemed to be happy was when she would sometimes go on tangents about living in the wild, surrounded by animals and bird chirps in the mornings. I remember I suggested to my parents that perhaps we could move out of downtown New York, which is where we were living at the time, and maybe go to a more natural area to help my sister. They shut me down, saying they both had great jobs here, and there was no way they were willing to give that up. They were convinced that my sister would grow out of her depression, but she never did. She only got worse. By the time she was 16, she was very depressed, routinely talking about not seeing a point in life and hating the monotony of day-to-day life in the city. I asked her if she wanted to travel with me. I was 19 at the time and was saving up money for an apartment of my own, but I figured I could set some money aside to make my sister happy. We ended up vacationing in Sweden, and for the 1 week that she and I were there, I had never seen her so happy. She smiled. That may not seem like a lot, but my sister never smiled, so this was a big deal. After returning from the holiday, my sister would not stop talking about Sweden and the scenery she saw there. She told me and my parents she wanted to move there when she was older, and when she talked about it, I saw her eyes glow like never before. Sadly, my parents shut her down, saying she's only a 16-year-old and that life can't just be lived self-sufficiently in some remote part of Sweden, which is what my sister wanted. My sister fell deeper into her depression, which lasted over 2 years. She never showed signs of actually going through with suicide, however. Until one morning, I found a note she had left in her room. It was her suicide note. She thanked me for the time in Sweden. I cried so much when I read it. She said she had thrown herself into the sea because if she couldn't live surrounded by nature, she could at least die surrounded by it. I told my parents, and instantly we informed the police, who tried long and hard to find her in the sea. Unfortunately, it was to no avail, and we had a closed casket funeral. The grieving period was very hard on our family, and I fell into a depression myself. My parents ended up quitting their jobs and starting a new life away from New York. I'll admit, I blamed them a lot. I told them on one occasion that my sister died because their stupid corporate jobs were more important than their daughter's life. They both cried when I said that, and I went up to my room. I knew what I said was wrong, but was I wrong in what I said? My parents ended up separating within the next few years, and I found life to be very hard, finding it impossible to get out of bed some days. For the longest time, I searched the internet, hoping my sister was still out there while being in deep denial of the fact that she was gone, but I never had any luck. I still have her note, and I keep it with me. It's my most cherished possession. Little did I know that the note I had would turn out to be the thing that brought light back into this world. I read it obsessively, almost every single day. It was a very long note with many paragraphs, but the structure of them never made any sense to me. I tried to solve why the paragraphs were laid out so strangely, but never did. She ended her paragraphs in places she didn't need to end them. She would run a sentence into the next paragraph. It almost seemed like she wanted to make each paragraph a specific length. I would count the lines over and over and look for dates or letters of the alphabet to spell something, but it never did. I had given up on trying to solve this non-existent mystery a while ago, but recently I found my answer. The length of her paragraphs corresponded with the effing coordinates of the place we visited in Sweden, which just happens to be a place she mentioned she wanted to live in. When I found that, I started going berserk. I also found that if you put the second last letter of every line with every last letter of every third line, she spells out a sentence about her building a cabin there for herself, but the words are jumbled up. I now know where she is. I have booked a plane ticket to go see her. I hope for the love of God this is real and I'm not crazy. I haven't told my parents yet in case I'm wrong and the false hope I gave them crushes them. I packed my bag with shaking hands, throwing in clothes without looking at what I grabbed. My laptop went in next, followed by the printout of Elena's note with all my calculations scrawled in the margins. I checked my bank account 3 times to make sure I had enough money for the trip. The flight leaves in 6 hours. I drove to the airport in a daze, nearly missing my exit twice. At security, the TSA agent asked me if I was okay because I kept dropping things. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I bought coffee at the gate but couldn't drink it. My stomach churned with a mixture of hope and dread. On the plane, I pulled out Elena's note again. I traced my finger over her handwriting, counting the lines for the 100th time. 62 degrees, 17 minutes north, 20 degrees, 34 minutes east. The coordinates burned in my mind. I'd memorized them weeks ago, but I kept checking, terrified I'd made a mistake. The woman next to me glanced at the papers spread across my tray table. I folded them quickly and shoved them back in my bag. I couldn't explain this to anyone. Not yet. The flight felt endless. I watched 3 movies without absorbing anything. The flight attendant brought meals that I pushed around on the tray. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elena's face. Not as she was at 16, but as she might look now at 21. Would her hair still be long? Would she still have that tiny scar above her left eyebrow from when she fell off her bike? When we finally landed in Stockholm, I practically ran through customs. The rental car agency took forever with the paperwork. The clerk kept asking if I wanted GPS, insurance upgrades, and roadside assistance. I said yes to everything just to speed things up. The drive north took 4 hours. I'd mapped the route obsessively over the past week, but Swedish road signs still confused me. I stopped twice for gas and energy drinks. My phone showed 17 missed calls from work. I'd called in sick for the week, but apparently they needed me for something. I turned the phone off. As Stockholm faded behind me, the landscape changed. Buildings gave way to forests. The trees grew denser, taller. This was the Sweden Elena had fallen in love with. I understood why. Even through my anxiety, I felt the peace of this place. The coordinates led me to a small town called Järvsö. I stopped at a grocery store to buy supplies, water, protein bars, and a better flashlight. The cashier said something in Swedish. I just nodded and smiled. My hands shook as I counted out the unfamiliar currency. From Järvsö, I followed a smaller road west. According to my calculations, I needed to drive another 40 minutes, then hike about 3 miles into the forest. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for one car. I hadn't seen another vehicle in 20 minutes. Finally, my GPS showed I was close. I pulled over at a small clearing and checked the coordinates again. This was it, or close enough. I'd have to go on foot from here. I loaded my backpack with supplies and locked the car. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. For a moment, panic seized me. What if I got lost? What if this was all just my desperate imagination? I forced myself to breathe. I had a compass, a GPS device, and enough supplies for 2 days. I could do this. The hike started easily enough. There was almost a trail, though overgrown with moss and fallen branches. Someone had walked this way before, though not recently. My heart rate spiked. Could it have been Elena? After an hour, the trail disappeared completely. I pushed through the undergrowth, checking my GPS every few minutes. The coordinates drew me deeper into the wilderness. My clothes snagged on branches. Mosquitoes buzzed around my head. I stopped to drink water and check my progress. According to the GPS, I was less than a mile away. The forest had grown so thick I could barely see 50 feet ahead. Doubt crept in again. Even if Elena had made it here, how could she survive? This was true wilderness. That's when I noticed it. A mark on a tree trunk. 3 parallel scratches, too deliberate to be natural. I found another set 20 yards ahead, then another. Someone had marked this path. My pace quickened. The scratches appeared regularly now, guiding me through the densest parts of the forest. My heart hammered against my ribs. This couldn't be a coincidence. The trees began to thin. Through the gaps, I glimpsed a small clearing ahead. I forced myself to slow down, to approach carefully. What if I was wrong? What if someone else lived here? Then I saw it. Smoke rising from a chimney. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed. A cabin sat in the middle of the clearing, small but sturdy looking. Solar panels glinted on the roof. A garden grew along one side, protected by a rough fence. Firewood was stacked neatly against the wall. Someone had built this. Someone lived here. I stayed crouched in the trees, watching. Part of me wanted to rush forward, to bang on the door, but I waited. I needed to be sure. The door opened. A young woman stepped out carrying a bucket. Her hair was short now, dyed dark brown instead of her natural blonde. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. She looked thinner but stronger somehow. It was Elena. I watched her walk to what looked like a well or water pump. She filled the bucket, then paused. Her head turned slightly, scanning the tree line. I held my breath. She went back inside. I sat there for another hour, paralyzed. She was alive. My sister was alive. All those years of grief, of blame, of depression, and she'd been here, building a life, the life she'd always wanted. Anger flared through the relief. How could she do this to us? To me? I'd defended her to our parents. I'd saved money to take her to Sweden. I'd fallen into depression, thinking I'd failed to save her. But the anger faded as quickly as it came. I remembered her face at 16, the hollow eyes, the scars on her arms, the way she'd flinch when anyone moved too quickly. Our uncle had stolen something from her that our parents refused to acknowledge. They'd dismissed her pain, told her to be normal, to fit into their corporate world. She'd found another way. As the sun began to set, I finally stood. My legs had gone numb from crouching so long. I walked slowly toward the cabin, making noise so I wouldn't startle her. I knocked. Footsteps inside. The door opened a crack. Elena's eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then her face crumpled. Charles? The door swung wide. She stood there, my little sister, alive and whole and sobbing. I pulled her into my arms and we both cried, standing in the doorway of her secret home as the Swedish forest darkened around us. We held each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Elena's body shook against mine, her tears soaking through my shirt. When we finally pulled apart, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and gestured for me to come inside. The cabin was small but meticulously organized. Handmade shelves lined the walls, filled with books, canned goods, and supplies. A wood-burning stove sat in one corner, a small kitchen area in another. Everything looked handcrafted, from the furniture to the curtains over the single window. Elena made tea while I sat at her rough wooden table, trying to process everything. She moved with practiced efficiency, completely at home in this space she'd created. When she finally sat across from me, steaming mugs between us, the silence stretched uncomfortably. She spoke first, her voice hoarse from crying. She told me about the months of planning before her disappearance. She'd researched survival techniques online, learned basic Swedish through free apps, and saved every penny she could get her hands on. She'd bought supplies gradually, hiding them in various places. The night she left, she'd taken a bus to the coast, then hitchhiked north, using cash for everything to avoid leaving a trail. I listened, my emotions cycling between relief, anger, and profound sadness. She explained how she'd found this spot during our vacation, had felt an immediate connection to it. She'd spent her first winter in a tent while building the cabin, nearly freezing to death more than once. Local hikers had helped her occasionally, thinking she was just an eccentric young woman seeking solitude. When she finished, I told her about the aftermath, how Mom had collapsed when we found the note, how Dad threw himself into organizing search parties, spending thousands on private investigators, the closed casket funeral, where Mom had to be sedated. The months of grief counseling didn't help. Their marriage was crumbling under the weight of blame and guilt. Elena's face remained impassive through most of it, but when I mentioned the divorce, she flinched. She asked about them now, and I explained how they lived in separate states, how Mom had moved to Oregon and Dad to Florida, both trying to escape the memories. Night had fully fallen by then. Elena lit oil lamps and started preparing dinner, rice and vegetables from her garden, supplemented with dried fish. We ate in relative silence, the weight of 5 years pressing down on us. She showed me where I could sleep, a small loft area she'd built for storage but had cleared out, apparently expecting I might find her someday. As I settled in with borrowed blankets, exhaustion hit me like a physical force, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there listening to the forest sounds, trying to reconcile the sister I'd mourned with the woman sleeping below. The next morning, Elena woke me at dawn. She had chores, she explained, and I could help or watch. I chose to help. We fed chickens I hadn't noticed the night before, collected eggs, and watered the garden. She showed me the solar panel system she'd installed, the rainwater collection barrels, and the root cellar she'd dug. Everything demonstrated careful planning and hard work. As we worked, she talked more freely. She told me about learning to hunt, though she preferred fishing, about the elderly Swedish couple who lived a few miles away and traded vegetables for repairs, about the peace she'd found in solitude, the healing that came from living on her terms. But she also revealed the darker moments. The first winter when she'd gotten so sick, she thought she might die alone, the loneliness that sometimes crushed her, the guilt over what she'd done to us. She'd created social media accounts under fake names just to check on us, and had seen the pain she'd caused. I asked the question that had been burning in me since I'd arrived. Why hadn't she at least let me know she was alive? Why let us grieve? Her answer was complicated. At first, she'd been afraid we'd force her to come back. Then, as time passed, it seemed too cruel to resurface. She'd convinced herself we were better off believing she was gone than knowing she'd chosen to leave. The lie had become easier than the truth. We spent the day doing maintenance on the cabin. I helped her patch a leak in the roof, reinforce the chicken coop, and clear brush from around the property. Physical work helped channel my confused emotions. As we worked, I noticed things about her I'd missed before. Small scars on her hands from building, the confident way she handled the tools, the peace in her expression that I'd never seen during her teenage years. That evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, I brought up the elephant in the room, our parents. What would I tell them? Elena tensed immediately. She wasn't ready, she said. Maybe she'd never be ready. The thought of facing them, of explaining, of potentially being forced back into a life that had nearly killed her, it was too much. I understood, but I also couldn't imagine keeping this secret. They deserved to know their daughter was alive. We argued, our first real conflict since my arrival. She accused me of not understanding the depth of her trauma, of prioritizing our parents' feelings over hers. I accused her of being selfish, of not considering the hell she'd put us through. The argument ended with her storming into the cabin and me sitting outside, frustrated and conflicted. Eventually, I went to bed, but we didn't speak again that night. The next morning brought an uneasy truce. Elena suggested we hike to a nearby lake she'd discovered. Maybe neutral ground would help. We packed lunch and set off through the forest, following trails only she could see. The lake was stunning, crystal clear water surrounded by pine trees, completely untouched by civilization. We sat on a fallen log and ate sandwiches while Elena pointed out various plants and their uses. Her knowledge impressed me. This wasn't the helpless, depressed teenager I remembered. This was a capable woman who'd built a life from nothing. As we talked, she opened up more about her reasons for leaving. The assault by our uncle had shattered something fundamental in her. Our parents' response, therapy and medication, and pretending everything was fine, had made it worse. She'd felt like a broken thing they were trying to glue back together instead of a person who needed space to heal on her terms. The city had become a prison. Every crowded subway car triggered panic attacks. The constant noise invaded her dreams. She'd fantasized about disappearing long before she did it. The Sweden trip had shown her it was possible. I began to understand, really understand, why she'd done it. But understanding didn't erase the pain of the past 5 years. We stayed at the lake until late afternoon, swimming in the cold water and lying on sun-warmed rocks. For a few hours, it felt like we were kids again, before everything went wrong. But reality waited back at the cabin. That night, Elena proposed. I could stay for 1 week. During that time, we'd work together on the cabin and reconnect. At the end of the week, I'd leave and decide what to tell our parents. She asked for time to prepare herself for whatever came next. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I'd decide. The thought of keeping this secret felt impossible, but so did betraying Elena's trust. The next days fell into a routine. Morning chores, breakfast, then whatever project Elena had planned. We repaired the fence, expanded the garden, and built new shelves. In the evenings, we'd read by lamplight or play cards. She taught me basic Swedish phrases and showed me her journals, years of thoughts and observations about her life in the forest. One entry particularly struck me. Written during her second winter, it described a moment when she'd considered giving up and returning home, but then she'd realized that home had never really existed for her. Our house in New York had been a place of pain and pretense. This cabin, built with her own hands, was the first real home she'd ever had. On my 4th day there, we encountered a complication. The elderly Swedish couple Elena had mentioned, the Lindgrens, came by unexpectedly. Elena introduced me as her brother, visiting from America. They seemed delighted but also curious. They invited us for dinner the next night. Elena was nervous about the dinner. The Lindgrens knew her as Sarah, a young American woman seeking solitude after family troubles. She'd kept her story vague, but my presence complicated things. We spent hours rehearsing our cover story. The dinner itself went smoothly enough. The Lindgrens were warm, generous people who seemed to genuinely care about Elena. They'd helped her through difficult times, they said, and were glad she had family visiting. But I caught them exchanging glances when they thought we weren't looking. Walking back through the dark forest, Elena was quiet. She'd built a life here based on half-truths and omissions. My presence threatened that carefully constructed existence. That night, she broke down. The stress of maintaining her secret, of constantly looking over her shoulder, of living with the guilt, it all poured out. She'd found peace here, yes, but at what cost? She missed us. She missed having a family. But she couldn't see a way back that didn't mean giving up everything she'd built. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless. There were no easy answers. No clear right or wrong. Just pain on all sides. The next morning, Elena was withdrawn. She went through her chores mechanically, barely speaking. I tried to give her space while helping where I could, but tension hung between us like a physical presence. That afternoon, while Elena was checking her fishing lines at the lake, I made a decision. I couldn't leave without at least trying to bridge the gap between her life here and the family she'd left behind. I used her satellite internet connection to email myself photos of the cabin, the garden, the life she'd built. Not to expose her location, but to have proof of her accomplishment if I ever needed to show our parents that she hadn't just survived but thrived. When Elena returned with fresh fish for dinner, she found me closing her laptop. Her face went pale. I quickly explained what I'd done and why. No location data, no identifying landmarks, just evidence of her strength and capability. She was furious at first, accusing me of violating her trust. But as I explained my reasoning, that our parents might need to see she was okay, even if they couldn't know where she was, her anger faded to resignation. That night, we had our most honest conversation yet. Elena admitted she'd been tracking our parents online too. She knew Mom had started a support group for parents who'd lost children. She knew Dad had thrown himself into charity work, raising money for mental health programs. They'd both found ways to channel their grief into helping others. The revelation that our parents had grown and changed too seemed to shift something in Elena. Maybe they weren't the same people who'd dismissed her pain. Maybe there was room for reconciliation, eventually. On my 6th day, we tackled the biggest project yet, expanding the root cellar. It required moving massive amounts of dirt and reinforcing walls with stones. We worked in companionable silence, communicating mainly through gestures and shared effort. As we worked, I found myself envying Elena in some ways. She'd found her purpose, her place. She woke each day knowing exactly what needed to be done. There was a clarity to her life that mine lacked. My job in tech support felt meaningless compared to the direct relationship she had with her survival. That evening, exhausted and dirty from our work, we sat by the fire pit outside the cabin. Elena had built it in her first year, she said, and it had become her favorite spot for reflection. She surprised me by bringing up our parents again. She asked detailed questions about their lives now. Where exactly did they live? What were their new jobs? Did they seem happy? I answered as best I could, watching her process the information. Then she asked about me. How was I doing? Had I dealt with my depression? Was I taking care of myself? I admitted that I'd struggled, that losing her had changed me fundamentally, but I was in therapy now, slowly working through the grief and guilt. She apologized then, truly and deeply. Not for leaving. She couldn't apologize for saving her own life, but for the way she'd done it, for letting me find the note, for making me carry that weight, for not finding a way to let me know sooner. I told her about the years I'd spent analyzing her note, convinced there was a hidden message, how I'd driven myself half crazy looking for clues. She smiled sadly and admitted she'd almost included a more obvious code but decided against it, afraid our parents might figure it out and come looking before she was ready. That night, I couldn't sleep. Tomorrow was my last day. I still didn't know what I'd tell our parents. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. I found Elena sitting by the dying fire at 3 a.m. She couldn't sleep either. We sat together in silence, watching the embers glow. Finally, she spoke. She'd made a decision. She would write letters, one for Mom, one for Dad, not explaining where she was, but letting them know she was alive and okay. I could deliver them when I felt the time was right. Maybe it would be enough to ease their pain without destroying the life she'd built. We spent my last day drafting the letters. Elena struggled with every word, starting over multiple times. How do you explain 5 years of silence? How do you apologize for necessary cruelty? How do you express love across such a vast gulf of pain? The final letters were simple, heartfelt, and deliberately vague. She was alive. She was sorry. She loved them, but couldn't come back. She hoped they could forgive her someday. She was proud of how they'd channeled their grief into helping others. As I packed my few belongings, Elena gave me a small wooden box she'd carved. Inside were photos of her life here, the cabin through the seasons, her garden in full bloom, herself looking healthy and strong. For our parents, she said, when I thought they were ready. The hike back to my car felt both too long and too short. Elena walked with me, helping navigate the forest paths. We talked about staying in touch. She had a post office box in a town an hour away that she checked monthly. I could write to her there. At the car, we stood awkwardly, neither wanting to say goodbye. Elena made me promise not to come back unless invited. She needed to know her sanctuary was still hers. I promised, though it hurt to do so. She also made me promise to take care of myself, to not let keeping her secret destroy me the way her depression had nearly destroyed her, to find my peace, whatever that looked like. We hugged one last time, both of us crying. Then she turned and walked back into the forest without looking back. I sat in the car for an hour, part of me wanting to follow her, to refuse to leave. But I'd made promises. The drive back to Stockholm passed in a blur. At the airport, returning to civilization felt jarring. The crowds, the noise, the artificial lights. I understood better now why Elena had needed to escape. On the flight home, I read and reread her letters to our parents, memorizing every word. The wooden box sat in my lap, its weight both comforting and burdensome. I'd found my sister alive, but in some ways, I'd lost her all over again. I thought about the week we'd spent together, the work we'd done, the conversations we'd had, the silence we'd shared. Elena had built something remarkable in that Swedish forest. Not just a cabin, but a life, a future, a version of herself that could exist without pain. But she'd also built walls. Necessary walls, perhaps, but walls nonetheless. Between herself and the world, between her new life and her old one, between the person she'd become and the family who loved her. As the plane descended toward home, I made my own decision. I would keep Elena's secret, at least for now. I would wait and watch our parents, gauge their healing, their readiness, and when the time felt right, not for me, but for all of them, I would deliver her letters. Until then, I would carry this truth alone. My sister was alive. She was okay. She was free. It would have to be enough. The customs agent welcomed me back to the United States. I smiled and thanked him, feeling like I was returning from much farther than Sweden. In a way, I'd traveled to another world entirely, Elena's world, where survival meant more than just staying alive. I'd left that morning thinking I might convince her to come home. Now I understood that she was home. The only question remaining was whether the rest of us could learn to live with that truth. I drove home from the airport on autopilot, the wooden box on the passenger seat beside me. My apartment felt alien after a week in the Swedish wilderness. The traffic noise from the street below made me flinch. I understood Elena's choice more deeply now. I called in sick to work again the next day. My supervisor wasn't happy, but I couldn't face the fluorescent lights and mindless tickets yet. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table staring at Elena's letters to our parents. The paper felt heavy in my hands. 3 days passed before I could function normally again. I went back to work, answered emails, and fixed computer problems. But my mind stayed in that forest clearing. During lunch breaks, I'd look at the photos I'd taken on my phone, careful shots that showed no identifying features, just proof of Elena's accomplishment. A week after returning, I decided to test the waters with Mom. I drove to Oregon on a Friday evening, arriving at her small house near Portland just after dark. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her. Her hair had more gray in it. We made small talk over dinner. She asked about work, about my dating life. I deflected most questions. After we'd cleared the dishes, I mentioned I'd been thinking about Elena lately. Mom's hands stilled over the sink. She turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral. I told her I'd been going through old photos, remembering good times. I mentioned the Sweden trip, how happy Elena had seemed there. Mom's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself. She admitted she thought about that trip often too. It was the last time she'd seen Elena truly smile. We talked for hours that night, sharing memories. I didn't mention the letters or the truth, not yet. I visited Dad in Florida 2 weeks later. He lived in a small condo near the beach, volunteering at a youth crisis center most days. He seemed healthier than Mom, more at peace with himself. But when Elena's name came up, I saw the pain flash across his face. He told me about the kids he worked with at the center. Many reminded him of Elena, lost, hurting, desperate for someone to see them. He said he tried to be the adult he wished he'd been for her. I almost told him then, but something held me back. I started writing to Elena through her post office box. My first letter was short, just letting her know I'd made it home safely. I told her about visiting our parents, gauging their emotional states. I didn't pressure her about anything. Her response came 3 weeks later, a brief note saying she was glad I was okay. She included a pressed wildflower from her garden. I kept it in the wooden box with her other letters. Months passed this way. I'd visit Mom and Dad separately, dropping small hints about healing and forgiveness. I'd mention articles about people who'd disappeared and started new lives. I'd talk about how sometimes leaving was an act of self-preservation, not cruelty. Mom started therapy again. She told me one visit that her therapist had helped her understand that Elena's pain had been deeper than any of us had realized, that maybe we'd all failed her by trying to force her into a life that was killing her slowly. Dad's work at the crisis center evolved. He started a program specifically for teens dealing with trauma and depression. He named it Finding Your Path. I knew Elena would appreciate the irony. I wrote to Elena about these changes. Her responses grew longer, more detailed. She told me about improvements to the cabin, about a moose that had started visiting her garden, and about the books she was reading. She never mentioned coming back or reaching out to our parents directly. 6 months after my visit, I made a decision. I invited both Mom and Dad to my apartment for dinner. It was the first time they'd been in the same room since the divorce. The tension was palpable at first, but we managed a civil conversation. After dinner, I told them I had something important to share. I pulled out the wooden box Elena had given me. Their faces went pale when they saw the photos. Elena standing in front of her cabin, Elena working in her garden, Elena looking healthy and strong and alive. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. I explained everything as calmly as I could. The coded note, my journey to find her, the week we'd spent together. They had so many questions. Where exactly was she? Could they see her? Why hadn't she contacted them? I answered what I could, protecting Elena's location and her need for space. I gave them her letters. Mom read hers first, tears streaming down her face. Dad read his slowly, as if afraid the words might disappear. When they finished, they sat in stunned silence. The anger came next, as I'd expected. How could I keep this from them? How could Elena put them through such hell? How could she be so selfish? I let them rage, understanding their pain. But gradually the anger gave way to something else. Relief that she was alive. Grief for the years lost. Guilt over their role in her departure. And underneath it all, a desperate hope that someday, somehow, they might see her again. We talked until dawn. Mom admitted she'd always known, deep down, that they'd failed Elena. That they'd been too focused on their careers, too dismissive of her pain, too quick to medicate rather than listen. Dad broke down completely, sobbing about the signs he'd missed, the help he'd failed to provide. I gave them the post office box address. I made them promise not to try to find her, not to pressure her, not to overwhelm her with their need for forgiveness. They had to let her set the pace. Mom wrote her first letter that week. She kept it simple, just saying she loved Elena, that she was working on understanding, that she'd wait forever if necessary. Dad's letter took longer. He rewrote it dozens of times before settling on a simple apology and a promise to do better. Elena didn't respond for 2 months. When she finally did, it was just a single line. I'm reading them. Give me time. More months passed. I continued visiting my parents, watching them process this new reality. Mom joined a support group for parents of estranged children. Dad threw himself even deeper into his youth work. They started talking to each other again, bonding over their shared pain and hope. I wrote to Elena regularly, updating her on their progress. I told her about Mom's therapy breakthroughs, about Dad's program expanding to 3 locations. I sent photos of them, not to manipulate, just to show her they were okay. A year after I visited Sweden, Elena sent a longer letter. She thanked me for being patient, for respecting her boundaries. She said she'd been considering reaching out more directly, but wasn't ready yet. She included photos of her cabin in winter. Beautiful, but harsh. I showed the photos to our parents. They pored over them like treasures, noting every detail. Mom pointed out the quilt on Elena's bed. She recognized the pattern as one her mother had taught her. Dad noticed the books on her shelf, many of which he'd recommended years ago. They started writing to Elena more regularly, not pressuring, just sharing their lives. Mom wrote about her garden, the recipes she was trying, and the books she was reading. Dad wrote about the kids at the center, the ones who reminded him of her, the ones he was able to help because of what he'd learned from failing her. Elena's responses remained sporadic but grew warmer. She asked questions about their lives. She shared more about her routines and challenges. She even included a recipe for mushroom soup she'd perfected. 2 years after my visit, I received an unexpected letter from Elena. She was considering a visit, not moving back, not reconnecting fully, just a visit. She wanted to see our parents, but needed me there as a buffer. She proposed meeting at a cabin she'd found for rent in upstate New York, neutral territory. I ran the idea by Mom and Dad separately. They were ecstatic, but terrified. We spent weeks planning, setting ground rules, and managing expectations. No pressure, no guilt trips, no trying to convince her to come home, just a chance to see each other. The day of the meeting, I picked Elena up from a bus station 2 hours from the cabin. She looked different. Her hair was longer, her skin tanned from outdoor work. She seemed nervous but determined. Mom and Dad were already at the cabin when we arrived. The moment Elena walked through the door, time seemed to stop. Mom made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Dad stood frozen, tears running down his face. Elena took a shaky breath and said the first words she'd spoken to them in 7 years. Hi. The weekend was awkward and beautiful and painful. There were tears and silences and careful conversations. Elena showed them photos of her life in Sweden. They showed her photos of their new lives. They cooked meals together, went for walks, and played board games. On the last night, sitting around a fire outside, Elena told them why she'd left. Told them, holding nothing back. The depth of her pain, the suffocation she'd felt, the death that had seemed inevitable if she'd stayed. Our parents listened without defending themselves, finally understanding. When it was time to leave, the goodbye was hard, but not devastating. Elena promised to write more regularly. She even gave them a phone number for emergencies. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning. I drove Elena back to the bus station. Before she got out, she hugged me tightly and thanked me for everything. For finding her, for keeping her secret, for helping bridge the gap she couldn't cross alone. I watched her bus disappear, then drove home. The wooden box still sat on my shelf, but it no longer felt like a burden. Inside were the letters, the photos, the pressed wildflower, artifacts of a journey that had changed all of us. Mom and Dad continued their separate lives, but with less weight on their shoulders. They wrote to Elena monthly, sharing their lives without expectation. Elena wrote back when she could, slowly rebuilding connections on her terms. I returned to my life too, but with a different perspective. I'd learned that sometimes love means letting go, that healing happens on its timeline, that family can exist across distances both physical and emotional. The secret I'd carried had transformed into something else, not a burden, but a bridge. Elena was still in her Swedish forest, still choosing her path, but she was no longer lost to us. She was just living differently, healing differently, loving differently. And that, I finally understood, was enough.